On today's video, we're going to be discussing the basics of guitar electronics. I'll say right off the bat, I'm not a professional when it comes to guitar repairs, wiring, or soldering. This video is more for people like me who aren't electrical whiz kids and just want their guitars to work. So I'll be breaking it down to the basics. I'll be making some very basic circuits in this video that can be useful if your alternative is taping all of your pickups directly to output, like I did when I was a kid. There are many ways to wire a guitar. This is just one of those ways. So if you're offended by nasty looking solder joints, potential ground loop issues, and elegant electrical concepts boiled down to concepts a dummy could understand, deal with it. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, so what we got here is a little test rig that I've constructed. Basically, it consists of 3 tuners, a nut, 3 humbuckers, and a bridge. The backside looks like this. We've got the backside of the bridge, the springs, the spring claw, and you can see the backside of the pickups. So that's what that looks like. Oh, and we got the tuners up here. So this is just a very, very basic setup, just to kind of really illustrate things. So these 3 wires we got coming out here correspond to these 3 pickups. We'll get to this hole later. We are going to put another wire through there. I guess the first thing we'll do is talk about the tools we'll be using in this video. So if you plan to work on a guitar's electronics, it is pretty much guaranteed that you will need one of these. This is a soldering iron. Now, this is probably one of the most inexpensive soldering irons you can get. I think these can be had for about $10 or $15. I've got a more advanced setup here as well. It's got like a temperature control and a holder and an on-off switch. But I gotta be honest, I just prefer this. The other tool that we'll be using in this video is a digital multimeter. Now, you can get by without one of these, but this is definitely helpful when it comes to diagnosing electrical problems. So the first thing I'm going to talk about with a soldering iron is the most important thing about using a soldering iron is, well, there's 2 really important things. The first thing is when it's plugged in, you got to make sure that that hot tip is not touching anything. If this is hanging down like this, as they sometimes do, you can see it's already caused a burn in that. This will melt your carpet. This will start a fire. The other important thing about using a soldering iron is you have to make sure you unplug it when you're done with it. It's probably obvious, but if you leave this thing plugged in, you are asking to have your house or shop or garage or whatever burned down. Definitely make sure you unplug it. So as I said, I've had this soldering iron for years and years, but I'll just mention this because I'm sure some people watching this video will have bought brand new soldering irons. The first thing you want to do with a brand new soldering iron is tin the tip. So all that means is you take some electrical solder and you just melt it on the tip. Okay, get it nice and on there. Whoop. So basically what you want to do is just get it on the tip. Then I would suggest using a wet paper towel, and then you just wipe the solder off the end. And then you can see there, even though the majority of this tip is like a corroded kind of brown color, the tip is a nice shiny metallic color. So that is what it means to tin the tip. Okay, so now that that is out of the way, we are going to talk about the solder. So there are a few different types of solder. I have 2 examples here. So first of all, we have electrical solder, which is exactly what you would want to use for soldering electronics. And beside it, we have plumbing solder. You would not want to use plumbing solder to solder electrical stuff and vice versa. The reason why you don't want to use plumbing solder on electrical stuff, aside from it being a lot thicker, is plumbing solder has an acid-based flux, which will basically corrode the electronics and ruin them. Whereas electrical solder has rosin-based flux, which obviously doesn't wreck electronics. It doesn't cause them to corrode. There are other types of solder out there, but like, for example, there's like a metalworking solder. Basically, if you're going to be soldering electronics, you need to make sure you're using electrical solder. All right, so there's a few different types of electrical solder you can get as well. I'm not going to go into the details about this. The stuff I got here is like the most common you'll find. While you're soldering, it's really important that you do not breathe in the fumes. This stuff is poisonous, as you can tell by the skull and crossbones on the little roll there. So you're going to want to do this in a well-ventilated area, maybe even having a fan blowing the smoke away. Ideally, you would have a hood sucking all the fumes away so you're not breathing it in. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do, just for my own peace of mind, is test these pickups to make sure that they actually work. So how you want to do this is set the multimeter to the ohms setting in the 20K range, and you're going to want to make sure that you have your black wire plugged into the black terminal, and then you got your red wire plugged into the ohms volts terminal. So to measure these, we're just going to take our two leads and we'll start with our bridge pickup. So just put one lead on each of the two wires here. So this has a reading of 11.3 kilo ohms. Now, that's pretty decent for a humbucker pickup. It's not going to set the world on fire, but it will sound decent. So let's move on to our middle pickup. So again, we're just going to attach it to the two wires we got here. So this pickup has a reading of 10.93 kilo ohms. Again, nice moderate pickup. Now, we'll test our neck pickup here. So this pickup has a reading of 6.94 kilo ohms. So in my opinion, this is kind of low. This is kind of what you would see on a single coil pickup, but the pickup will still work. It's just kind of a weak humbucker at this rating. At the end of the day, all three of our pickups work and we're golden. All right, so these humbucking pickups each only have two wires, which is kind of the most basic setup you'll get for a humbucker. You can get humbuckers with 4 or 5 wires per pickup, which gives you more options like coil tapping, but that's not something we would cover in this video. If you have a pickup like that, you can usually look up online what each wire does and, figure it out from there. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the output jack. So on the type of output jack you would typically see on a guitar that has passive electronics is a mono output jack. That means it only has 2 terminals. One of these terminals corresponds to the sleeve and the other corresponds to the tip. So if we look at a guitar cable, we can see that it's divided into 2 sections by a little black divider, an insulator. This portion here on this side of the divider is the tip. This portion here on this side of the divider is the sleeve. When you plug your guitar in, you can see that this part here touches the tip of the cable while the sleeve of the cable is contacted by this ring here. And if you're unsure of which terminal goes to what, you can just look carefully at the output jack. So you can see here that the one terminal we're currently looking at is attached to the sleeve. So obviously that will be the sleeve terminal. And then if we look at it on the side, you can see that this tip piece is actually one continuous piece and it attaches on that terminal. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's wire up the most basic electric guitar circuit that you can get. That is pickup direct to output. So on this particular circuit, what we're going to do is take the hot wire of our bridge pickup, which in this case is the white wire, and we're going to attach it to the tip terminal on our output jack. And then we're going to take our ground or negative wire, which in this case is the bare wire, and we're going to attach it to the sleeve of our output jack. Now, there is actually a third wire we need to attach for this circuit, and that is a bridge ground. I don't currently have a bridge ground attached, so we're going to do that right now. Okay, so for this demonstration, I'm going to be using black wire for my grounds. So all of the grounds that you see me doing in this video are going to be black. Anyway, so I got a nice piece of black wire here. Now this black wire is 22 gauge and it's a multi-strand wire, meaning the actual wire itself is made up of a bunch of little wires. You can also get solid core wire, but it's not as good. It will work, but really you want to get some multi-strand wire. So all I'm going to do is strip the insulation on this. Now, I use a knife to do this. A lot of people will tell you this is not a good way to do this because you can cut the actual wires inside, which is 100% true, but that's just the way I've always done it. You can also get wire strippers that do this sort of thing, but in my experience, it's just easier and faster for me to use a knife. So our bridge ground, we got to attach it to our bridge. So on this style of bridge, which is a Stratocaster style bridge, the bridge ground attaches actually to this little tiny tab here on the spring claw. Now, if you got a different style of bridge, like a Tune-o-matic bridge, or like you're working on a bass, for example, that just has a plate bridge that bolts to the surface, a lot of those, you don't actually have to solder the wire to the bridge. You just kind of pinch it between the wood. And as long as the bare part of the wire is in contact with the metal of the bridge and it's pinned in there so it's not going to move, that's good. But on this style of bridge, it actually gets soldered to the spring claw. So we're going to do that right now first. Okay, so the thing about soldering is you got to make sure that you sufficiently heat up what you're soldering. Now, this piece that I'm soldering onto right now, because it's a huge piece of metal, relatively speaking huge, it's going to take a while to heat this up. So I'm just holding my soldering iron here on this claw right now, waiting for it to heat up. And you know what? While I'm here, I'm just going to put my wire there as well. So we're just going to do that, hold it there. Now, if you do melt a little bit of solder, it can help heat things up quicker, but at the same time, don't be fooled into thinking that it is soldered. So I'm just going to melt a bit on here, onto the actual iron itself to melt it. And you can see it's not doing anything right now. It just balled up there. So we've got a ways to go in terms of waiting for this to heat up fully. All right, I'm going to put a little bit more solder on here. Okay, our ground wire is now soldered on there nicely. I can actually lift this whole thing up by it. But you can see there's a little glob of solder beside it that's not even attached. That's because it landed in a spot on this spring claw that wasn't sufficiently heated. You got to make sure that the components, both of them, are sufficiently heated in order to get a nice solid bond. So we'll just get this little piece out of here. Now we have our bridge ground attached. Let's put it through the little hole on the body I made, and we will get back to wiring up our most basic guitar circuit. Another good thing to do is after you've soldered, take your wet paper towel and just wipe off the tip of your soldering iron. Just keep the tip of it clean. It will make your life so much easier. Okay, so now we've got our ground wire for our bridge. otherwise known as our bridge ground. We're going to strip the end of it. Now we're just going to mount the output jack onto this section of pick guard I have here. There we go. We're going to put our hot wire, this white wire, to the tip. All right, so I got my hot wire onto my tip terminal, and I'm going to heat up the terminal and the wire with my soldering iron. There we go. Going to clean the tip. So the next thing I got to do now is attach this bare ground wire to the ground terminal on this output jack. But I also got to attach this bridge ground to the ground terminal on the output jack. So I'm just going to put these two wires together. Let's give them a little twist. Now I will mention, a lot of people will say that you should tin these wires prior to soldering them. I personally don't like to do that, but I'll show you what it is. It's basically just heating up the wires and then just basically pre-melting solder into the wires. So these wires are now tinned. I don't like tinning the wires myself because it makes them less flexible, and also it makes them a little bit harder sometimes to get through the hole in the terminal. Okay, so now I'm just going to again heat up both the terminal and the wire with my soldering iron. All right, there we go. All right, so that's the most basic guitar circuit. We got our one pickup wired directly to our output, and we also have the bridge ground connected to the sleeve of our output with the ground wire of the pickup. So all we got to do now is test it out. Okay, turn on my amp, and then we got it coming through the amp. Let's add a little bit of drive. All right, so now that's out of the way. Let's move on to the second most basic guitar circuit, which is one pickup with one volume. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is actually unsolder this. I'm going to introduce another tool here that not necessary, but it's definitely handy to have. This is a solder sucker. So what you do is you heat up your solder until it's liquid, then you hit a little button, and it will actually suck the solder into the pipe. So the first thing I'm going to do is just unsolder this ground side. And really it's just you're heating it up until you can pull the wires out of it. Okay, so there we got the wires pulled out. We'll pull this wire out of here too while we're here. Okay, there we go. Now to use a solder sucker, all I'm going to do is heat this up until it melts again. Then suck it up, and then you can see it kind of just puts it out there. And then we'll just do this a little bit more till we get this nice and cleaned up. Okay, so as you can see there, I got my terminals nice and clean and ready to use. All right, so in order to have a volume control on your guitar, you're going to need an additional component, which is what is known as a potentiometer or a pot, or some people call these variable resistors. I'm sure there's other names for them as well. So this is a used pot, which is why all that kind of gross stuff on the back there is rosin from the solder. But you can see we've got 3 terminals on the pot. So I'm just going to get this mounted up in here quickly into this pick guard. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of a diagram to help explain this. So what we're looking at right now is the back side of the volume pot. Basically, how it is in here right now is what we're looking at. All right, so for this explanation, my red marker is going to be the hot wire, and my black marker is going to be the ground wire. So the first thing we're going to do is we have our wires coming from our pickup. So let me just draw the pickup in here real quick. We got our negative or ground wire from our pickup. That is going to come over and get soldered to the back of the pot. Okay? Then we're going to get our hot wire from the pickup, and that is going to come to this first terminal, all right? And it's going to get soldered on there. We're going to get our bridge ground, the wire coming from our bridge, and that's going to come in and also get soldered to the back of the pot. And the other thing we're going to do is solder this third terminal to the back of the pot, grounding that out. Now, I guess we should also have our output jack here. Hopefully that makes sense. That is the output jack. This little line here represents the tip, and then this shorter line represents the sleeve. So we're going to have our wire come from the sleeve of the output jack and solder to the back of the volume pot. And then from the center lug, we're going to have the hot wire come off and get soldered to the tip of the output jack. I'm just going to write on here, bridge. And this is going to introduce an important concept in guitar wiring that is a key concept in guitar wiring. And that is all the grounds are connected. For the time being, we're just going to wire up this particular circuit. Okay, so there we go. We've got our volume control all soldered up. So we got our wire from our pickup here, that bare wire soldered to the back of the pot. We got the white wire from it, which is the hot wire, soldered to the first terminal on the pot. We've got our bridge ground soldered to the back of the pot. We've got our sleeve from our output jack soldered to the back of the pot. And we've got our third terminal from the pot soldered to the back of the pot. Now all that gross stuff on there is rosin, and you know what? There's probably guys out there that are way better at soldering than me that will have a solution on how to clean that up. But honestly, I don't care that much about it. I'm not a professional. I'm just some guy who fixes his own guitars. Anyways, so now we've got the center terminal with the red wire, and that is attached to the tip terminal on the jack. Now, one thing I will say is this lead from the red wire is sticking out a little bit too far here. That could potentially come into contact with something and short it out. So I'm going to actually trim that off. All right, so let's just throw a little volume knob on here. Beautiful. All right, now I'm just going to plug it in, and I'll go turn on my amp. All right, so we'll turn it up. There we go. All right, so now we're going to do the third easiest electric guitar circuit, and that is one pickup, one volume, and one tone. In this diagram, we're going to have the ground wire from our pickup go to the back of the volume pot. We're going to have the hot wire from our pickup go to the first lug on the volume pot. We're going to have our bridge ground go to the volume pot, the back side of it. You'll see this little symbol on wiring diagrams. It's basically like an arrow made out of dashed lines. All that means is ground, but this is from our bridge. We'll go from our sleeve on our output jack to the back of our volume pot. We'll go from our third terminal on our volume pot to the back of our ground pot. And we'll go from our middle terminal on our volume pot to the tip on our output jack. So as it stands right now, our circuit is the same as it was when it was just the volume pot. So how the tone works is what it does is basically bleed the high frequencies of your signal from your pickup off to the ground, which removes them from the hot side of the circuit. And what that translates to is a more dark, I guess less, you know what a tone dial does. It does that. You need a capacitor for a tone dial. A lot of times what you'll see on guitars are these little green kind of looking capacitors on a tone dial. Now these ceramic disc capacitors, I've come to learn, are not good for a guitar circuit because they become microphonic, which basically means they introduce noise into your signal. So definitely I would not recommend putting these into your circuit. And then this is just another example of a capacitor. So capacitors come in different values. You know, for humbucking pickups, these capacitors here, this green one and this red one, they're 22 nanofarad. So for if you have single coil pickups, I believe the value you would want to use is 47 nanofarads. But you can experiment with different capacitors. They just basically will filter off different amounts of the treble, I guess, to the ground. Hopefully that makes sense. Anyways, let's talk about how you actually wire this thing up. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is attach the back of the volume to the back of the tone. The next thing we're going to do is run a wire from the first terminal on the volume pot to the third terminal on the tone pot. So I'm just going to jump over that wire there and attach it to there. So these two wires are not connected, just to be clear. Now the next thing we're going to need to do is attach a capacitor. So we'll just draw a little circle there with the word cap on it. So the capacitor is going to attach to our middle terminal on our tone pot. And then the other terminal from the capacitor is going to go to the ground. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is attach our first terminal from our volume pot to the third terminal on our tone pot.
Now we will attach a capacitor from the second terminal of the tone pot to ground.
Now we just got to run a wire from the back of our tone pot to the back of our volume pot. All right, so first things first, let's put a tone little knob on here. Okay, we'll plug her in, turn on the amp. Okay, so we got our volume and our tone turned all the way up. We'll turn our tone down. Now, one thing I'm going to say is these circuits can actually be wired differently than how I have them wired here. This is just an example of how you can wire them to hopefully maybe explain how they work a little bit better. But basically, I guess the best way I can describe it in a way that makes sense to me, you just are getting rid of stuff you don't want to the ground. If you want to get rid of some volume, you send part of it to the ground. With the tone, if you want to get rid of some of the higher frequencies, you send the higher frequencies you don't want to the ground. And I'm sure somebody a lot smarter than me could explain that in a way that's more scientific or whatever, but That's the way it makes sense to me. Hopefully that makes sense to whoever's watching this video too. But once you really grasp that aspect of it, and that all the grounds are connected together, that's like the key part of understanding, passive guitar wiring. For example, like instead of soldering all these grounds to the back of the volume pot, I could have soldered them all to the back of the tone pot. Or, I mean, I wouldn't suggest doing this because it'd be a huge disaster, but you could really even solder them all to this. You know, the sleeve of the output jack. You could solder half of them to the volume, half of them to the tone, as long as they're connected. That's all that matters. So hopefully that makes sense. But this, what I got here, is probably the most basic way that you could wire it. And I think it's probably the easiest way to understand. At this point now, we can really start branching off into multiple directions. If you got a volume pot, you can just wire it up like this. Say you have multiple pickups attached to a switch, and the switch hot was going to this terminal, and the switch ground was going to this terminal, and you only wanted to have a volume and a tone. You could just leave the rest of this setup the way it is, and the volume and the tone will work for all 2 or 3 pickups you've got. Now, if you wanted to have a separate tone for each pickup or a separate volume for each pickup, that's going to get a little bit more tricky, but the same basic concept of this will apply to it. I'm going to go into another example here to maybe, hopefully, possibly shed a little bit more light onto this topic. All right, so now is when things start getting a little bit interesting. We're going to be adding in a second pickup to our circuit with a volume and a tone control. So it's going to be 2 pickups, 1 volume, 1 tone, 1 switch. So these switches, this particular style, actually, if you just look at it, you can kind of figure it out. So what I have here is a diagram of the bottom of this switch. So this middle lug, this big thick one here, that one, is basically attached to the body of the switch, and that is the ground, that thick center one. Now there's 2 in the center that come together. That is the output of the switch, and then the corresponding outer prongs is where you would have the 2 inputs of the switch. All right, so let's just say we put our bridge pickup on the far right terminal on the top, and our neck pickup on the far left terminal on the top. When this switch is in the center position, both would be sent to the output, because if we look in here, we can see there's terminals touching. So I've flipped this switch, and you can see at the bottom there's a white little plastic piece, and it has separated the terminal on the right side. So the far right terminal is no longer in contact with the middle terminal, meaning that connection is broken, meaning in this position, when the switch is going to the left, the connection between the bridge and the output of the switch is broken. So this, when it's switched to the left, gives us only the neck pickup. And if we switch it the other way, whoa, this is very hard to do with one hand, but if we switch it the other way, you can see the connection on the left side is broken, and the connection on the right side is reestablished. So when the switch is to the right, only the right terminal is touching, only the bridge pickup is Only the bridge pickup is going. Now again, we'll put it back to the center, and you can see both terminals are touching. Right? That makes sense? Hopefully. Anyways, so understanding how to incorporate this switch into the circuit, into this particular circuit where we only have one volume and one tone, is pretty easy. All we're going to do is have the hot wire from our bridge come into one of these terminals. So let's just put it here. We'll go bridge hot. And then over here, we'll go neck hot. And then coming out from here, this will go to our volume. Okay. And where it's going to hook up is right here on our volume pot on the first lug. And that's how it's going to get added into this circuit. So instead of our circuit having this pickup here, this is going to be replaced with the switch. So the hot output from our switch is going to go here. So then here on the ground of our switch, this is going to go to our volume, and it's going to go to the back of the volume. And then the other thing is
our bridge pickup ground.
It's going to go here on our switch. So we got our bridge
pickup
ground. We're also going to have our neck ground. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Let's wire it up. All right, so the first thing I need to do is unsolder my pickup from my volume pot here. Whew. So I've got my hot wire from my neck pickup, and I got my hot wire from my bridge pickup soldered onto the top two terminals like I was saying. Now I've got my ground wire from my neck. I've got my ground wire, this bare wire here, from my bridge. And I've got an additional piece of wire, and I'm going to solder all three of those to this negative terminal here. And then the other end of this wire is going to get attached to the back of the volume pot. I could just as easily attach it to the back of the tone pot if I was so inclined. It wouldn't make a difference. All right, now I'm just going to attach my wire from the switch output to the first lug on the volume pot. All right, so there we go. Hopefully that made sense. Hopefully I'm explaining this well. So now we're just going to try it out and see what we got here. Now to check that I actually have both pickups working, I'm going to take a screwdriver that's made out of metal, something magnetic, and I'm just going to tap on both of the pickups. Okay, nothing's coming out of that one. So we got our neck. Our middle obviously is not on, it's not hooked up. And then we got our bridge, so we got both. Now I'm going to switch the switch. So it should just be the bridge position now. Bridge works, middle's off, neck is off. So now we'll switch it to just the neck here. So perfect, so our switch works. So that's great. But what if we want to have all three of our pickups hooked up? Like at the same time, I mean. All right, so I'm just going to add this switch in here so that when I have my main toggle switch in the middle position, I can add in my third pickup, my middle pickup, so I can have all three pickups going at once. The only problem is I don't really know what's going on with this switch. So let's figure that out together using the multimeter. All right, so I got my multimeter here and I've switched it to the continuity setting here. Basically, I have the one lead from my multimeter attached to the center terminal on one side of the switch. This is a 2-position switch. I guess you could say it's an off-on or on-on switch. So with the switch in this position, if I touch the lead to this terminal, it makes a noise. So there's continuity between those two terminals when the switch is in that position. Now, I'll touch the other terminals. None of the other terminals are making a noise. So we flip the switch. So now, if I touch this terminal, the one that was initially making a noise, nothing. But if we touch this other side, it does make a connection. So that tells me that, you know, when the toggle's in this position, it's engaging this terminal. And when it's in this position, it's engaging this terminal. Now I'm willing to bet that this other side of the switch does the same thing. So let's just check that. I've moved it to the other center terminal. Yep. All right. Now that we know how the switch operates, we can use it to wire up our middle pickup. Okay, so this switch, how we're going to wire it up is we're going to take our wire from our pickup here. We're going to attach the white wire to one of the terminals on the far end. And we're going to attach the ground wire, the bare one there, to the actual case of the switch where there's already that melted on solder there. And then we're going to attach a wire from the center lug of the same side we attach the hot wire from the pickup to. And we're going to attach that to our switch on the center lug that goes to our volume pot. And then, of course, we're going to attach the ground from this switch. I think I'm just going to attach it to the back of the tone pot because, again, the grounds are all interconnected, so it really doesn't matter. All right, so that micro switch was really hard to solder to because, well, it's just very small, and I'm not the most best solderer. So anyways, hopefully you can see what we got going on there. That is a dreadful solder joint, but hopefully it works. Hopefully it stands up. But yeah, so in the position it's on right now, this middle pickup should be on. So let's turn it off and let's see how this works. All right, so we'll plug it in, turn on the amp. Right now we should have our bridge and our neck, but no middle. Now let's turn on the middle. Okay, so we got our middle, neck, and bridge.
So we have all 3 pickups on at the same time.
So I guess that's the basics of guitar wiring. Hopefully I explained it in a way that makes sense. I think I mentioned this earlier, but there's a few different ways you can do things. You can put the volume before or after the switch, and the same with the tone. You can have multiple volumes, multiple tones, and there's actually quite a few different ways to wire a tone control I didn't mention in this video. So if you found this video interesting or have some tips for myself and others, let me know in the comments. And if you're still watching, do me a favor, leave a like on this video. It really helps out with the channel and I appreciate it. And if you want to see how I build on these concepts in my next video, make sure to subscribe. I'll be installing some new pickups in my Strat and wiring it up the old school way. And if you can't wait until then, check out one of the other cool videos on the screen right now. Until next week, talk to you later.
And don't forget to unplug your soldering iron.